I want you to remember a time when you stood gazing at the stars in the sky. Now, when I was a kid, my parents told me to reach for the stars. Sadly, I later learned that stars are just giant fiery balls of gas. So you don't want to really reach for them. You would burn yourself anyway if you could. But just think about looking into the universe, the night sky. From our perspective, standing on the earth, it feels like everything is immovable and that the stars and the moon are slowly moving around the earth, orbiting the earth. Now, we know that not to be true, but people believe for thousands of years that it was the stars and the sun and the moon that revolved around the earth. That is until a guy named Nicholas Copernicus came along and changed everything. Now, he's attributed with proposing a model of heliocentrism, which places the sun at the center of the solar system and the universe. But he did a lot more than that. His theory went on to revolutionize the way science is done, the way we view ourselves in the cosmos and in the universe. And it's called a Copernican revolution. Copernican revolution. Now, as human beings, we're often caught up or stuck in our human point of view unless something comes along and revolutionizes our perspective. Now, we are in our second week of our 3-week series called Author of Life, and we're talking about how God is the author of life, how he created it, and he loves life. And Jesus himself said that I have come that they might have life and have it to the full. And at this time, this series, we've been talking about how as we approach the end of life, our own life or the lives of our loved ones, what are some of these principles? What are the things that we need to hold to? Especially as it pertains to questions like euthanasia, assisted suicide, medical aid in dying. And today I want to talk about human dignity and perspective. Now, have you ever wondered to yourself, have you ever asked yourself the question about what is it that makes your life worth living? Have you ever kind of pondered that question? What are the values that we often hold about what makes life meaningful and valuable? You probably thought to yourself at one point, maybe it's my freedom. If I ever lost my sense of autonomy, if I lost my sense of self-determination, perhaps life would be a little bit less worth living. Or perhaps you wondered to yourself, if I stopped being a useful member of society, a contributing member, if I was ever a burden to my family, who had to provide for my basic sustenance and needs, maybe I wouldn't want to live anymore. Or maybe you thought to yourself, or you watched as a beloved member of your family or a friend suffer terribly, and you thought to yourself, maybe that suffering that they've experienced has eroded the value of their life. Maybe their life is no longer worth living as a consequence of the suffering that they experience. It's eroded the quality of life, we'll often say. Now, these questions are worth thinking about, these sorts of values, because at one point in our life, we're all going to be faced with making very important decisions that are going to be based upon the values, what we hold as meaningful for life, either for ourselves or for somebody that we love. Now, we tend to, the culture in which we live and ourselves, we often have a tendency to measure human life, the value of human life, in terms of those sorts of 3 values I just shared: utility, autonomy, and quality, right? Utility being, am I a contributing member of society, or am I a burden? Autonomy being, do I have personal freedom, or have I lost my sense of self-determination? And quality of life, right? Is life enjoyable and meaningful and satisfying? Or is it full of suffering and pain? And we'll use these principles often in the culture in which we live, and we'll apply them to determine about the questions at the end of life, about whether or not life is still worth living, right? And they often inform the choices that people make about aid in dying, medical assistance in dying, assisted suicide, euthanasia, things like that. But I wonder, is there another criteria? Is there another perspective that we should be able to bring to bear on determining the quality and the value of human life? Now, believe it or not, these values, they're not new values, right? We've had them for millennia. More than that, these questions about end of life and euthanasia and medically assisted suicide, these aren't new questions that our culture and our society invented. In fact, they're very ancient. We have examples coming from ancient Roman culture, right? Self-caused death was often seen as a virtuous act. There's some great Roman heroes, politicians, and generals who took their own life and were hailed as the heroic thing to do. We have examples of Cato, a Roman politician who refused to submit to the rule of the dictator Julius Caesar, and so he took his own life, and he was hailed as a hero, lifted up. Self-caused death was often seen as an expression of autonomy in the face of a life that is no longer worth living. We also have, for example, evidence of people taking their own life because they lost their sense of utility or usefulness to society. For example, there was a Roman colony on an island where once people reached the age of 60, they were given hemlock poison to drink because they were no longer seen as contributing members of society. It was viewed as the right thing to do. They were seen as a burden. Right? In that kind of society, Father Simon would be living on borrowed time. But when it comes to quality of life, for example, we have evidence that people who suffered severe physical pain or emotional pain, oftentimes they didn't even need to have physical illness. They could just have lost the will to live. They were able to petition the Roman Senate. And if their application, was approved, they could go to a doctor, receive hemlock poison to take their own life. Medically assisted suicide, over 2,000 years ago. See, these end-of-life issues that we struggle with today in our culture and society, these questions that we're asking ourselves, they aren't new. They're actually very old and ancient. And yet, these very questions about suicide or medically assisted suicide, euthanasia, these practices virtually disappeared from Western civilization for almost 1,700 years. Why? Well, because a Copernican revolution came along and changed everything. And so, for example, we have Paul, one of the apostles' earliest followers of Jesus. He writes to a church in the city of Corinth, Greece, which was in the Roman Empire. And he says to them, he declares to them this revolution has come. And he says, as a consequence of this revolution, from now on, therefore, we regard no one from the human point of view. We no longer view the human person as a consequence of this revolution that has occurred from our human perspective, because something has come and changed everything. What is it that happened? Well, Paul very simply says that he died for all. That Jesus died for all. You see, the reason we don't see any human being from a human point of view anymore is because Jesus, who is the Son of God, God the Son, has come and laid down his life, who was crucified on a cross for every single human person who ever lived. And we think about it this way in our modern consumerist culture, right? Value is based on exchange. The value of something is determined by what somebody else is willing to pay for that, right? Now, if Jesus, who is God the Son, died for us, that means that we were purchased at an infinite price. That means you were purchased by what is most precious to God, his very own Son. And you have infinite value and dignity. And why did he do that? Well, Paul continues. Jesus died so that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and was raised for them. In other words, he died for you so that you might live for him. He died so that every life might have a purpose and a destiny and a direction and meaning. Jesus died. He purchased us for himself, that we might live with him and for him in eternity. And that means that a person who is suffering, who is immobile, who is useless by today's standards of society is not any less valuable because of their condition. From the point of view of the author of life, every life is sacred. Every life has dignity. Every human life is inviolable, and nothing can take that away. Not the quality of life, not the loss of autonomy, not the loss of utility. Nothing. We used to think that everything revolved around the earth. But guess what? Copernicus has called. The earth does not revolve around you or me or anyone else. It revolves around the sun. The Son of God. This is the revolutionary event in human history. It is the cosmic event. Jesus is the center point of all existence and all creation, and everything that exists revolves around him. He is the greatest revolutionary event in history. And that's why Paul says that if anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. Everything has become new. We have a new vision for life. We have new values for life. We have a new perspective on life. And these questions raised by the culture today about medical assistance in dying, about euthanasia, medically assisted suicide. These aren't, the answer to these questions are found in Jesus. All the greatest questions and the answers to those questions are found in Jesus. Now, this has practical consequences for the decisions that we make, the lives that we live. It means that we have to allow Jesus into our lives and our hearts to change our perspective, to change our values, to change the way that we live. It means that we are called to testify to the world, both in our words and in our actions, about the love of God and the intrinsic, inviolable dignity and value of every human person. It means that we must challenge the flawed values that we see in the world in which we live and have these important conversations with the people that we love and care about. And it means that we are called to live and serve and love those in the world who are the most vulnerable, who suffer the most, people whom perhaps the culture and world in which we live doesn't see the value in their lives, that we, as followers of Jesus, are called to serve them and love them and protect them. And it means that we cannot ever choose medical assistance in dying for ourselves or for our loved ones because it violates and denies the intrinsic, infinite value of the human person. I want to tell you about someone who, from a human point of view, had lost all autonomy, all utility, poor quality of life. From a human point of view, their life was not worth living. Her name is Martha Robin. She was born into a peasant family in a little hamlet in France in 1902, March 13th. She was the sixth child. She was the baby of the family. And she was described as a happy young girl, open to the future, full of life, helpful, and sometimes mischievous. But tragically, Martha became very sick. At the young age of 16 years old, she contracted a form of encephalitis that eventually led to almost a total loss of autonomy. Okay, she developed total paralysis of her whole body. She developed a hypersensitivity to light, which means she couldn't go out during the day. And as a consequence of her paralysis, she was confined as a prisoner to her own bed in a darkly lit bedroom for over 63 years. 63 years she spent in the bedroom in which she was born, in darkness. More than that, she was totally dependent on her family. She was a financial burden. Her father once condescendingly said that she could not even earn the water that she drank. She had very poor quality of life. She was constantly suffering. She used to experience headaches that were so painful she would scream at the top of her lungs. And that's not to mention the psychological, emotional anguish of not being understood by the people around you, by feeling alone and isolated in your suffering. And her life ended at the age of 79. She died at 1981. Now, from a human point of view, her life was not worth living. And yet, we don't measure the value of human life on any of those things, utility, quality, or autonomy. But we measure the value of the human person based on the criterion of the cross of Jesus Christ. You see, her life had infinite value and dignity because Jesus died for her. And her life belonged to him. And she would say that, I don't live for myself, I live for Jesus. And because of her commitment, because of giving her life to Jesus, she lived in this deep and profound, intimate communion and friendship with him always. From the isolation of her dark bedroom, she did amazing things. She established 2 schools, an all-boys school and all-girls school. She founded a religious community of priests and lay people called the Foyer de Charité. There are over 70 of these houses and communities all throughout the world today. And more than that, people flocked from all over France and Europe to visit her because they recognized in her this woman of incredible holiness. She was a mystic, and she would give advice to people who are longing to hear from God. People would bring their prayers to her, and they would seek her advice and her kindness just to be close to this incredibly holy woman. It's estimated that over 100,000 people came to visit her in her darkly lit bedroom. And today, the church is considering her cause for canonization to become a saint because of her heroic witness to the dignity of life. Now, who could say her life is not worth living? In fact, not me, not you, nobody has the right to say that because her life belonged to Jesus. In fact, she's more alive than perhaps any of us ever will be in our lives. No, we no longer see people from a human point of view. We see them having been purchased by the love of God, of infinite value. Every life has intrinsic importance that no amount of suffering, that nothing can take away. And we are called to be a people who witness to the love of Jesus and the dignity of the human person by guarding every human life from the moment of conception to the moment of natural death. We're called to be a church which says yes to all of life and receives the gift of life from the hands of God, the author of life. We are a community which sees nobody from a human point of view. We see human life from the perspective of the cross, which is the greatest Copernican revolution in history, because Jesus has changed everything.